Welcome to session 37 of Through the Bible in 90 Days. Today we will look at three takeaways from Job chapter 8, verse 1 through Job chapter 24, verse 25. How suffering can be a means of deepening our understanding of God's sovereignty and character. How trusting God in the midst of an unanswered questions and suffering is a mark of true faith. How self-righteousness is an obstacle to understanding God's grace, and humility is essential for receiving God's wisdom. I'm Dr. J. David Taylor. Remember to subscribe, like, follow, comment, and share. Let's get started. Takeaway 1. Suffering can be a means of deepening our understanding of God's sovereignty and character. In Job 8, Bildad responds to Job's lament by insisting that God only punishes the wicked and blesses the righteous. See, Job's friends' arguments suggest that suffering is always a direct consequence of sin. However, Job's experience challenges this view, revealing that suffering may not always be the result of personal sin, but can be a part of God's larger plan, which may not be fully understood. Okay, this passage also teaches us that suffering does not necessarily equate to God's displeasure. Instead, it can be a way to deepen our trust in God and bring about his divine purposes, even when we cannot comprehend the reason behind it. The scripture says this in Job 8:4, if thy children have sinned against him, and he has cast them away from their transgressions. Job 8:8 says, for inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, and prepare thyself to search of their fathers. Takeaway 2. Trusting God in the midst of our unanswered questions and suffering is a mark of true faith. Now, throughout Job chapters 9 through 13, Job's responses to his friends' accusations become increasingly bold as he expresses his desire for God to answer his questions. See, Job struggles with the lack of clarity surrounding his suffering, yet he continues to affirm his trust in God's ultimate justice. He realizes that he cannot fully understand God's ways, but acknowledges that God is sovereign and worthy of trust regardless of the circumstances. So for believers today, Job's story is a reminder that trusting God, even when we don't have all the answers, is a profound expression of faith. The scripture says this in Job 9:2, I know it is so of a truth, but how should man be just with God? Job 13:15 says, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, but I will maintain mine own ways before him. Takeaway 3. Righteousness is an obstacle to self-righteousness is an obstacle to understanding God's grace, and humility is essential for receiving God's wisdom. See, in Job chapter 15, verse 15 to 17, Eliphaz and his friends accused Job of self-righteousness, believing that only the wicked suffer. Now, Job in turn defends his innocence, but recognizing that his suffering has humbled him. See, through his trials, Job learns that true righteousness cannot be achieved through self-reliance. Instead, it is through humility and dependence on God that one can experience true restoration. So for believers today, Job's experience teaches us that our own efforts at self-righteousness are inadequate and that we must approach God with humility, acknowledging that only by his grace can we stand before him. Job 12:5 says this, he that is ready to slip with his feet is a lamp despised in the thought of him that is at ease. Job 13:4 says, but ye are forgers of lies. Ye are all physicians of no value. So what do you do? Or what do we do when we don't have answers? See, when the struggles seem too hard and the questions too many, how do we really respond? See, in the book of Job, we see a man who has lost everything, yet he still seeks answers, still seeks God. His friends offer him answers, but Job, in his pain, realizes that the questions he asks may not have easy answers. His faith doesn't collapse, though. Instead, it becomes deeper, more genuine, as he learns to trust God even without understanding. See, how often do we turn to God in our suffering, not for explanations, but for a deeper trust? Here's the core challenge that we face. When life becomes overwhelming and the answers seem out of reach, will we continue to trust God? See, Job's struggle is not just with his suffering, but with the lack of answers. His friends give him explanations that seem logical, but Job knows something deeper. See, God is still God, and his ways are always higher than ours. So the question becomes, will we surrender to God's sovereignty, even when we don't have the answers? See, the real issue is whether we will keep trusting God in the midst of unanswered questions, maintaining faith in his goodness, even when we can't understand his ways. My God, we need to shift our perspective. What if we viewed suffering not as a reason to abandon our faith, but as an opportunity to trust God even more deeply? See, Job's story challenges us to trust God in our darkest hours, not for the answers we want, but for the God that we need. See, the breakthrough idea here is that suffering doesn't separate us from God. But if we trust him through the suffering, it can deepen our relationship with him. So just as Job continued to cry out to God, even in his confusion and pain, we too can experience a greater trust in God's sovereignty as we walk through life's trials. So this is the moment to take an action. Will you choose to trust God, even when the answers aren't clear? Like Job, you may face trials and you may face confusion, but you don't have to walk through them alone. See, God is present in our suffering, and he desires us to draw near to him during those times. See, your pain doesn't need to lead you to despair. It can lead you to a deeper relationship with God. Will you trust in his goodness and sovereignty, even when you don't understand your circumstances? See, the time is now to surrender your questions and find peace in God's presence. So I challenge you today, will you surrender right now? Will you surrender your need for answers and trust God in your suffering? Will you stop relying on your understanding and instead seek to know God more deeply through the trials you face? See, Job's faith was tested, but it was also refined in the process. Your faith too can be refined, but it requires that you trust God completely, even without all the answers. See, today is the day to lean into God's sovereignty and find peace in his presence. Will you trust him with your suffering? Will you trust him with your questions? I have 3 personal declarations reflecting my willingness to align with God's divine will. I declare that I will trust God even in the midst of unanswered questions, knowing that he is sovereign and good. I declare that I will not rely on my own understanding, but will surrender to God's will and God's wisdom in all things. I declare that I will continue to seek God's presence and remain faithful to him, even when the answers to my struggles are unclear. My time is up. I'm Dr. J. David Taylor. Thank you for joining us. Please remember to subscribe, like, follow, comment, and share. I look forward to seeing you next time.